As the competition from rival trading companies, especially the French East India Company, began to grow, the officers of the English East India Company began to realize that if they wanted to maximize their profits in trade, they would have to eliminate their rivals from the areas they were controlling. And to do this, they realized that gaining political control of these areas was necessary. And the British started this endeavor of theirs from Bengal. The British realized that Bengal was their most important trading center, more important than any other trading center on the western coast of India. In fact, when the British first came to India, they set up their first trading station at Hooghly in 1615. Soon after, they fell into trouble with Aurangzeb for not following trade restrictions in India. This conflict led to the Anglo Mughal War of 1686 to 1690. This time, Aurangzeb had a much powerful army at his disposal. Thus, he was easily able to defeat the British. Here you can see an image of a British officer asking for forgiveness after the English East India Company was defeated at the Anglo Mughal War of 1686 to 90. Somewhat impressed by the submission of the British, Aurangzeb in 1690 agreed to grant them a Farman which allowed the English East India Company to carry out duty-free trade or tax-free trade in Bengal. Now, how did this work? So, the company was issued dastaks or trade permits. The company was required to show these dastaks or trade permits at those trading toll booths, and they were exempted from paying any taxes while trading. It was around this time that the company realized that in order to carry out their trade successfully, they would require a permanent and strong base at their disposal. Thus, in 1690, Job Charnock, who was an official of the English East India Company, merged three villages of Sutanuti, Kalikata and Gobindapur in Bengal to form the city of Calcutta. This image right here shows you an old view of Calcutta from the banks of the very famous Hooghly River. Soon after, the company started the fortifications of the city by establishing the Fort William in Calcutta in 1696. 2 years later, the company gained the revenue collecting rights of Calcutta in 1698 from the then Mughal emperor. Now what happened was that since the company had the revenue collecting rights of Calcutta, they could exercise a greater control over this area. All was going well, but Aurangzeb died in 1707. Soon after, Farrukh Siyar became the new Mughal emperor. He was ready to renew the use of dastaks in 1717, but he refused to give the British any other trade benefits. Somewhat annoyed by this and somewhat taking advantage of the fact that Farrukh Siyar was a much weaker ruler, the British started misusing the dastaks. What did they do? They started to misuse the trading rights or dastaks to carry out their personal trade tax-free in Bengal. What exactly happened was the company as a whole carried out a trade in Bengal, but also individual officials of the company carried out their individual trades as well. Now the individual members of the company started to use these tax permits to exempt themselves from paying taxes while carrying out their own trade and not the company's trade as a whole. This naturally meant that the Bengal treasury was receiving even less money than it was receiving before. Thus, as you can understand, the relationship between the English East India Company and the Nawab of Bengal became strained. From then onwards, the Bengal Nawab Murshid Quli Khan and his successor Ali Vardi Khan began to keep a strict watch on the British activities in Bengal. However, the company continued to disregard the Bengal Nawab's orders. In fact, in 1755, the company tried to assert their own freedom by renovating the fortifications of Fort William in Calcutta without securing the Nawab of Bengal's permission. This conflict between the English East India Company and the Bengal Nawab reached its highest point when Siraj-ud-Daulah became the new Bengal Nawab in 1756. Siraj-ud-Daulah was very angry with the British ways. He, in fact, threatened the British with dissolving their trade rights if they did not stop their misuse of the dastaks. Siraj-ud-Daulah also, in an attempt to build a successful resistance against the British, allied with the French, who, as we already know, were the greatest enemies of the British at India that time. When the British still did not mend their ways, Siraj-ud-Daulah attacked Calcutta and captured Fort William on 20th June 1756. That very same day, soldiers of Siraj's army forced several English officials into a small room in Fort William. This small room had only one single window as a ventilation mode. Thus, several English officials died of suffocation. This event is known as the Black Hole or the Holwell tragedy. This enraged the British to a great extent. Thus, Robert Clive, who was a military officer of the company, moved towards Bengal from Madras with his force, and a war between the company and Siraj called the Battle of Plassey became inevitable. Now, in order to ensure his victory in the upcoming war, what Robert Clive did was that he joined hands with some members of Siraj's court who did not want Siraj to remain on the throne anymore. Why was this? Well, different people had their own reasons. While some did not like Siraj because of his rude behavior, others, like Mirjafar, wanted to become the Bengal Nawab himself. So, Robert Clive very cleverly bribed Mirjafar, joined hands with him in order to ensure his victory and defeat Siraj-ud-Daulah. Thus, the armies of Siraj-ud-Daulah and Robert Clive met on 23rd June 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Now, as was planned, Mirjafar held back his contingent during the battle. Now, it so happened that the contingent Mirjafar was leading was the biggest contingent in Siraj's army. Now, when the biggest contingent of Siraj's army was not fighting, his forces became very weakened and the British were able to defeat him. This portrait shows you a meeting between Robert Clive and Mirjafar after the end of the Battle of Plassey. Now, as was promised by the British, Mirjafar was made the new Nawab of Bengal in 1757. But it turned out that he became a puppet ruler in the hands of the British. This simply meant that even though Mirjafar was the Nawab of Bengal in name, he and all decisions taken by him were actually controlled by the British. Mirjafar soon realized that in order to hold on to his position as the Nawab, he had to keep satisfying the British demands. So, Mirjafar had to give the company huge sums of money. the zamindari or revenue collection control over the district of 24 Parganas and renewed their right to free trade. In fact, Robert Clive himself received control over a big jagir from Mirjafar. Now what happened was, after the British gained control over Bengal, they changed their economic policy a little bit. How? Well, previously, the English East India Company was bringing wealth from Britain to buy Indian goods. Now, after they were securing and extracting a lot of wealth from Bengal, they used this wealth to buy Indian goods. This meant that Indian goods were now bought with Indian money and it did not receive an additional income from Britain. The Battle of Plassey not only made the company an unchallenged political force in Bengal, but it also made them the strongest trading force in India, more than any other trading company in India that time. Thus, after the Battle of Plassey ended in 1757, we can say that Bengal became a British territory. Now, as it turns out, after some time, Mirjafar was unable to drain the state treasury anymore to satisfy the British. The company thus replaced Mirjafar with his son-in-law, Mirkasim, who became the new Nawab of Bengal in 1760. Just after becoming the Nawab of Bengal, Mirkasim gifted the British the control over Burdwan, Midnapur and Chittagong districts. As it turns out, Mirkasim proved to be even more vulnerable to British demands. He continued to provide more economic benefits to the British. Now, he did so partly because he thought that if he gave more economic benefits to the British would stop their misuse of the dastaks and the Bengal treasury won't be drained that much. But it did not happen that way. The British continued their misuse of the dastaks. Now, what happened was, Mirkasim, seeing no other way to control the British, adopted a very intelligent strategy. He opened the duty-free trade advantage to Indian merchants as well. Now, why did he do so? Because previously, even though the British did not have to pay taxes for trade, the Indian merchants had to do so. Naturally, the products that the Indian merchants were selling were priced at a higher price point than the British. The local people obviously brought the cheaper goods from the British, and the Indian merchants were facing huge losses. Now, when Mirkasim opened duty-free trade to Indian merchants, they were able to lower the price of their products and thus pose a competition against the British. Now, having lost their advantageous position, the British were naturally angered, and thus they decided to replace Mirkasim with Mirjafar, who once again became the Nawab of Bengal. As we can guess that Mirkasim was naturally very angered and very hurt. So what he did was, he left Bengal in 1763 and formed an alliance with Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, who was the then Mughal emperor. These three people allied themselves against the British, and they wanted to make a final attempt to remove the company's control over Bengal. Thus, the Battle of Buxar was fought in October 1764. However, the company managed to defeat the combined forces of Mirkasim, Shah Alam II, and Shuja-ud-Dawla. Here is a very interesting image. You can see the British military plans for the Battle of Buxar. If you look at this image carefully, you can see how the British planned to place their soldiers, their cannons, etc. Now, after their victory at the Battle of Buxar, the British definitely gained complete control of Bengal. But since the Nawab of Awadh was also involved, the British got control over Awadh as well. Here, only after the Nawab of Awadh, Shuja-ud-Dawla, paid a hefty sum of money to the company and the districts of Kora and Allahabad, that the company returned the control of Awadh to Shuja-ud-Dawla and made him the Nawab of Awadh again. Awadh now became a buffer state or a neutral zone. The company used Awadh to protect the Bengal territory from northwestern attacks. Apart from this, the company also signed the Treaty of Allahabad with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II on 12th August 1765. According to the terms of this treaty, Shah Alam II granted the Diwani or revenue collecting rights of Bengal to the company. In return, the company agreed to pay an annual tribute to Shah Alam II and handed over the districts of Kora and Allahabad to him. Thus, with this treaty began the formal rule of the British in India. Now, why are we saying that formal rule began now? Because after Battle of Plassey, the British had virtual control over Bengal. But it was only with this treaty that they gained official revenue collecting rights and the right to administer that territory. Now, as a result of this treaty, a system of dual government came into place in Bengal. So what did it exactly entail? Well, the English East India Company now had control over revenue collection, military and judiciary powers in Bengal, while the Bengal Nizamat or the government under the Nawab of Bengal had no effective powers. Now, since the British were given so much powers, we can very well guess that they exploited their powers. What they did was they began to manage all their expenses with the wealth collected from Bengal. The Indian economy was deprived, for the British now used money collected from Bengal in other parts of India, whether to administer the region or buy goods from there. It did not bring any additional money from outside, from Britain. Thus, India was using its own money to pay for its administration. Now what happened was, as the British gained more and more power in Bengal, the officials of the company started to envision a life of luxury almost like that of the Nawab of Bengal for themselves. This can be traced to Robert Clive, who had amassed a lot of wealth from Bengal. Robert Clive had come to India in 1743. But when he left India in 1767, his net worth was over 400,000 pounds, which you can understand was a lot at that time. He had gained all these from Bengal itself. His wealth was so shocking that in 1772, he was even cross-examined by the British Parliament, who was very suspicious of his gathered wealth. However, just 2 years later, in 1774, Robert Clive committed suicide after being acquitted. Acquitted means that he was released from all his accusations. However, not all English officials could gather as much wealth as Robert Clive. Those who gathered a lot of wealth and went back to Britain started living flashy lives and showing off their riches. They were called Nabobs, which is an anglicized word for Nawab. These people were seen as upstarts and social climbers in the British society and even were made fun of in cartoons and plays. You can understand this by seeing this image, which is an 1811 caricature of British Nabobs. This was released on a British newspaper. The British also forcibly closed down small handicraft industries like looms for weaving clothes. This naturally put several small artisans out of a livelihood. Now, exploitation by the British harmed agricultural production in Bengal as well. But how did it do so? Well, the British pressurized the peasants to a great extent to pay them as much revenue as they wanted. The peasants obviously were oppressed so much that they left agricultural lands and moved away. Now, the Nawab of Bengal also could not do anything to improve this situation because he was almost practically controlled by the British. Now, since there was no agricultural production or there was a lack of agricultural production, so food production in Bengal also came down. This led to one of the worst famines Bengal has ever faced in 1770, where thousands of people in Bengal died of starvation. However, it was this famine that urged the British officials to check their ways. The British realized that they can't continue like this, for it was creating a bad name for them outside. And secondly, they were not being able to make profits when production in an area was coming down. So, the dual government system was ended in 1772. The post of the Nawab of Bengal was abolished and the British took over complete control and responsibility of the region, and Warren Hastings became the first Governor General of India. Thus, we can say that while the Battle of Plassey injected the British into Bengal politics, it was the Battle of Buxar that confirmed its control over this region. Thus, their increased power and dominance over Bengal encouraged the British to carry on expansion in other parts of India as well. Thus, by 1856, the English East India Company had managed to control almost the entire of India, as you can see here. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So, at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So, register for free now.